So have you ever been reading a Jane Austen novel and it's just going swimmingly until you come to a word that you're either like, A, what on earth is that? Or B, did she just say that? I thought this was supposed to be a very clean Regency romance. What is happening here? Well, that's what we're talking about today. Words that either don't really exist anymore or ones that have definitely changed their meaning since Jane Austen's times. Today, our vocabulary lesson will be on the topic love and marriage terms. And this video was actually requested by one of you, my awesome viewers. So if you have any other video ideas or requests you'd like to make, please leave it down in the comments below and I will add them to my list of the great video ideas. My name is Ellie Dashwood and this is my channel where I talk about classic literature, history, and writing. If you like any of those topics, please subscribe. The first one is the term out. This being the term Lady Catherine de Bourgh uses when questioning Elizabeth about her family.
Your younger sisters, are they out in society?
Yes, Mum, all.
Or would all five out at once? Oh, that's very odd.
Lady Catherine just can't believe it that all of Elizabeth's sisters are out. So what did it mean to be out in Regency and Victorian times? Basically, for young ladies, that meant they were out in society, aka they can go to balls, they can go to parties, and guys can hit on them. Yeah, that's right. There was an official moment when a girl stopped being a girl and became a woman who could go dance with people, date people, be Lydia Bennett apparently. For different classes of people, this meant different things. Of course, if you were of the nobility or you were super rich, you would come out by being presented to the monarch. We see this even happen in Downton Abbey when Rose is presented to the king and queen of the time. After that moment, they would officially be out in society. Before they were presented, they were still considered a little girl. Guys couldn't hit on them. They pretty much stayed home when everyone else went out to party. But after they were out, they participated in something called the season. I'm going to make a whole other video on the season, but imagine the season being in the spring and summer, 100 days of nothing but partying, literally all day parties every day. You had breakfast parties, you had dinners, then you had balls after the dinners, and then you would have later balls after the earlier balls. That's right, you needed multiple balls in one day. And why? It's because the season was the upper classes' form of a marriage market. They were trying to get everyone married off. If you were a girl and you came out but you weren't married off within 3 seasons, then you were an old maid and you were just sad. But of course, for people who weren't in the super upper echelons of society, being out pretty much meant that you could go to the Netherfield ball. I think the most in-depth description of being out versus not being out can be found in chapter 5 of Mansfield Park. So if you want to see Jane Austen's take on some of what being out versus not out meant, go read Mansfield Park. Of course, you should read Mansfield Park anyway, because it's great. Okay, the next term up is the one my great viewer, thanks viewer, requested, which is lover. So this is not lover, aka Taylor Swift's version of lover.
I take this magnetic force of a man to be my lover.
The basic definition of the word lover is someone who loves something. I just did a video on the ultimate gift list for book lovers. You should check that out if you haven't. But again, book lovers. So being a lover of a person meant a romantic suitor, someone trying to woo someone over. And if they were both in love with each other, like say Elizabeth and Darcy by the end of the book, then they would both be each other's lover. There was no sleeping together involved until after marriage. So very similar to that term is making love. Now, it's very interesting that the usage of the term making love to mean sleeping together did not come about until about 1950. So all those generations before 1950 had this other definition of making love, which was when a lover was trying to woo over the person they loved. For example, when Darcy's like,
"You must allow me to tell you how ardently I admire and love you."
He was making love to Elizabeth by trying to woo her over with romantic advances. But again, not what we think of it as today. So I think it's super interesting to look at the history of words and where they came from, and also how they evolved through the years. And I feel like the next word on this list is obviously super famous for Jane Austen misunderstandings because of how it has evolved in our times, which is the word intercourse. Okay, we all know what this means today, but do you know what it meant in Jane Austen's time? I'm going to read you the definition straight from this dictionary. It says, intercourse meant frequent and habitual meeting and contact, social communication between persons, mental or spiritual exchange, or intercommunication. AKA, they were good friends and liked to write each other letters or have deep chats about the meaning of life. That is what intercourse meant during the Regency era. Now, it's actually really interesting because it had meant that for hundreds of years in society, but it was during Jane Austen's lifetime when it started to be applied to sex, of course. Before that, it was not connected to that topic at all. So it's interesting that we have this word that pretty much means talking to each other and it evolves into a term that most people now associate with sex, when the next word on our list is the exact opposite. And that is the word conversation. Yes, we're talking about the same word. You would say, I had a great conversation the other day about why Jane Austen is awesome. Yeah, so the word we use to describe talking to someone and having a discussion was originally a word that meant to have sex. Even in Shakespeare's work, he used the word conversation as a euphemism for sex, and it didn't take on the meaning of talking back and forth with someone till later. Now, by the time Jane Austen was alive, it did have that talking back and forth meaning, and I think that was probably the common meaning by the time Jane Austen was alive. Now, this is a form of conversation that meant to have sex. This is relevant to Jane Austen and the Victorian era and even today, because that led to the phrase criminal conversation, which meant having an affair. Yeah, so if a married person had an extramarital affair, that would be called a criminal conversation. So that is a random factoid. It can actually still be used in some legal systems as an actual term describing an affair. Criminal conversation. Up next is a word that a lot of you might know and a lot of you might not know, and that's why I included it, because I feel like it's still pretty common, but it's falling out of usage, which is chaperone. Now, a chaperone is a person who pretty much follows a single girl who is now out in society around so that no guys hit on her or have any sort of conversations with her that could lead to ruining her reputation. For example, in Victorian London, if there was a young unmarried woman, she would not be seen simply running around the town by herself. So basically all of this was done to prevent her from being alone with a man, because either one, something could happen, such as them sleeping together that results in the ruining of her reputation, or two, just being alone with him and everyone knowing that could hurt her reputation and cause people to gossip and be like, hey, maybe something did happen. There was no chaperone there. We see this in Sense and Sensibility when Marianne went off to explore Willoughby's house and they were alone, and that raised some eyebrows and some speculation, as Eleanor points out. Then we also see this in Emma when Jane Fairfax chaperones her friend and her friend comes out, never leave her alone. Otherwise, something could happen. Next up, we're moving straight to these people are engaged. Now, if you want to learn more about the word engagement itself, the many ways it was used, then check out this video I made about 5 Pride and Prejudice words you should know, because I include that in there. But now let's assume they are engaged and they want to get married. The next thing they would need to do is either buy a marriage license or have banns read, or if nobody's approving of this marriage, run away to Scotland.
I am going to Gretna Green, and if you cannot guess with whom, I shall think you a simpleton, for there is but one man in the world I love.
All of those topics I cover in this other video about why does Lydia Bennett want to run away to Scotland. Actually, I cover so much about marriage in that video. I cover all the licenses and some interesting acts of the law that affected marriage during that time. So definitely go check that out. So say we have Elizabeth and Darcy and they've agreed to marry each other, but now what comes next? A very important step before they can get married is for their parents, or in Mr. Darcy's case, since his father father is dead, Mr. Darcy and Elizabeth's father, to work out something called a marriage settlement, aka the Regency version of a prenup. Only it functioned differently because it was very much concerned with a woman's money and how that would be managed during her marriage. Because, of course, when a woman got married in Regency England or Victorian England, or before women's rights started to make a serious dent on this state of affairs, basically a woman was owned by her husband. Everything she had was owned by a husband. Legally, she melted into him in the eyes of the law and didn't really have any rights. So, of course, for families marrying off their daughters, they were very worried about this. For example, Elizabeth was going to be getting £1,000 upon her mother's death. Well, what if Darcy just totally spent all that? Of course, we all know Darcy wouldn't, and he's super rich, but that was a fear. So basically, these marriage contracts would outline how the woman's money could be legally used, what would happen to it upon her death. It would talk about provisions for any children she had, and it would also talk about something called pin money, which was an allowance a husband would grant his wife so she could buy clothing or other personal necessities, which I think is just so weird. Basically, it was trying to set up a legal contract before this new husband got a hold of all of his wife's resources so that she would be protected. So they have marriage settlements, they're getting married, and guess what they're gonna do? They're gonna get married on a weekday in the morning. In fact, it was by law, it had to be before noon for some reason. I guess they just get their marrying done before noon.
When? High noon?
Noon. I do my killing before breakfast. 7 o'clock.
So if your wedding is in the morning, then that sort of rules out having a wedding dinner. So most wedding dinners were actually wedding breakfasts. So we even see this happen in Downton Abbey. When the housekeeper and the butler get married, they have a wedding breakfast, which in the Regency and Victorian times was the common way it was done. So next up is honeymoon. Now this was a word that was in use, but believe it or not, when someone said honeymoon, it did not involve flying to Barbados for 2 weeks. I know, totally unforeseeable. Actually, the origin of the word honeymoon, I feel like, is very much debated. Everybody has their own theory. I've heard both that it was because the bride's family was supposed to supply them with a month of honeymead before they got married so that they could drink honeymead for the first month of their marriage. And of course, the month is based on the word moon because it's about a moon cycle. So honey plus moon, honeymoon. But of course, other people are like, no, honeymoon is actually kind of a depressing idea, that all the sweetness you get out of marriage, right? Like you get married, you're so excited, you have a month of just being like, oh, it's so sweet, it's just like honey. And then after that, you're like, actually, no. Marriage is horrible. Why did I do this? I don't even like this guy. So no matter which story behind honeymoon you prefer, basically it did refer to the month after the wedding. And while richer couples would go on something called a wedding tour or a wedding trip, which during Regency times was usually around England, or after all the wars in France ended, they would go and they would tour Europe in the Victorian times. Most couples just got back to everyday life after the wedding. Next up is the term lady. Now I included this one because, as we talked about before, a woman when she got married, she pretty much became her husband's. And we even see this in the terms of how she's talked about by others. In the very first chapter of Pride and Prejudice, we get this line. I'm going to dramatically read it to you now. "My dear Mr. Bennett," said his lady to him one day, "have you heard that Netherfield Park is let at last?" So, of course, this is talking about Mrs. Bennett and Mr. Bennett, but did you notice how it said his lady? Basically, this wasn't just Jane Austen looking for synonyms so she didn't have to repeat words. This was a common way wives were referred to. So a woman got married and then she had a baby. The newspaper announcement would read, "Lady of Mr. Fitzwilliam Darcy was delivered of a healthy girl on Monday morning." Yeah, that's right. She would be lady of her husband. So this was just a way women were talked about during the Regency times. So actually, if you notice in this dramatic reading, where she says, "My dear Mr. Bennett." Have you ever wondered why she goes around calling her husband Mr. Bennett? I actually have a whole video on that on the forms of address in Regency, England. So you should definitely check that out. It's very interesting why she continues to call her husband Mr. Bennett. The last one I want to cover in this video is actually a law, and it is the Bastardy Act of 1733. And this is just a really interesting concept I thought I'd include in this video, which is that it was illegal for a man to father an illegitimate poor child. That's right, that was illegal. Basically because now this poor child would be a drain on the resources of the parish that would probably have to step in to help this poor unwed mother raise this child and keep it from starvation. So what would happen is if a woman who was poor shows up pregnant and she's not married, what they would do is they bring her before the local magistrates and make her swear to tell them the truth of who the father is. Then they would drag the father in and give him 3 options. Now, the first, if he wasn't already married to someone else, of course, was to marry her, right? Because then he would be the husband and father of this child, and he would thereby be responsible for providing for them financially. Now, if he doesn't want to marry her, or if he's already married, he has 2 other options. One being he has to reimburse the parish for helping raise this kid financially. Now, if he didn't want to do that, his third and final option was to be in jail for a while. That's right, he'd have to serve a jail sentence because he fathered an illegitimate child. Now, I just thought this was an interesting historical fact that I would share with all of you. And that's it for today's video on Regency, Love and Marriage, Jane Austen vocabulary list. And again, this video was requested by one of my totally epic viewers. Hi viewers, you're awesome. If you have any questions about classic literature history you would like me to answer in one of these videos, please leave it in the comments below and subscribe if you like history, classic literature, writing. Yes, thank you. Okay, thank you.